Hey, so it's the second to last day now. We leave in just under 24 hours back to Australia. So I need to hurry up and finish some of these videos. So I'm going to do 3 days at a time now and shoot another one in a couple of hours. So last time I spoke, I was talking about the asylum policy. After that, we actually went on a 2-day excursion. We went to Brussels. So we packed up and left at about 9 in the morning. We got to Brussels at 2 o'clock, and we went straight to the European Parliament. So that's their sort of administrative seat, because the home seat, as I said, is in Strasbourg. But that's where most of the work's actually done, because that's where all the EU centres sort of are. There's a quarter of Brussels called the European Quarter, and it's all European Union offices. So we got to the European Parliament, we visited the hemicycle where they sit, and we got a few photos there, as well as there's a circle of flags as you enter the foyer. So we all got a photo with the British one, because it's not going to be there much longer. And we had a lecture from a employee of the European Civil Service, who is half British, half Polish, who gave a really in-depth sort of non-partisan view of the European Parliament and what it does, and it covered a lot of what we already covered, but it was great to hear it from somebody who actually works there and knows how it runs. So that was really, really cool. We got to ask a few questions of how it actually works in practice, which is a rare opportunity, I think, to actually get to speak to somebody who works there, who's not there just as a tour guide, but he's there to speak to you from an academic and practical perspective, to sort of fill you in, rather than, like I said, outsider looking in, you've got an insider view, which is really, really cool, really useful to sort of put everything in perspective. So we went to the hotel after that, and from about 5 o'clock till, well, for the rest of the day, we had the whole day off, so I went and visited my cousin and his partner Sonia. They both live in Brussels, so that was cool, good opportunity to go meet them and see their new child. So that was a fun little bonus for me, that while I'm here studying, I actually got to go see some family who I don't get to see very often. Then the next morning we had a breakfast and checked out, and we had more free time in the city, so we went to the Grand Place in the middle of the city, and we went to the famous chocolate shops and the Tintin store, where I am unashamed to admit that I did buy a couple of Tintin comics. We met back at the hotel and we went to the European Commission. So the European Commission sort of has a visitors' centre. The building is just for visitors to learn about the Commission and to get mini lectures and things. So we had 3 hours worth of lectures on European climate action policy and the EU environment policy. So they were both from the press and media officers from those respective committees. And again, they sort of told us where the Commission was at, what it's trying to do, and some of the roadblocks it hits. So most policies that the Commission wants to create runs into trouble in the Parliament and in the Council when you're trying to get approval from all parties, particularly with climate policy, because it can be seen as a negative economically. But they were saying it can create a whole new industry in Europe, and there's a lot of opportunities for investment in climate science, renewable energy, in a lot of investment in renewable energy that they're trying to build. They're working very hard to keep to the Paris Agreement, which understandably they would, being obviously the agreement was signed in Paris. The EU would want to be one of the first countries to meet all the targets. They have a similar carbon pricing policy to Australia, or what we have had in the past anyway, where you've got a set amount of carbon you're allowed to give out each year, and if you don't give out that much, you can sell it to another company so they can put out a little bit more, but every year they're bringing the ceiling down. The carbon ceiling keeps coming down, so that eventually companies will be carbon free. It incentivizes becoming greener and more renewable, because you can sell your carbon credits that you won't be using anymore to another company, and it makes it more profitable to be renewable, which is an interesting way to tackle that often economic argument that it's harder to transition the whole world from a fossil fuel industry to a renewable industry. And I think the EU is sort of a leader in this field. And we had the officer from the environment Commission, the Directorate General of the Environment. The big problem in Europe is air quality that they're really trying to improve, and that comes largely through changing the standards of cars. There aren't many old cars in Europe anymore because of these policies, and it is working to improve the air quality, but they've got a long way to go. And one of the issues they face is that the air quality is improving in the EU, but these old cars are still being sold elsewhere, so it's sort of a regional effect on the environment, which is a good start, but it does have its complications. So after those lectures, we left the commission, got on the bus back to Otzenhausen, which was a long journey again, but a fun one. We all got to get to know each other again a bit better. I got to do some more work on my literature review, which I finally just finished, so I'm feeling pretty good about that. Then the next day back at Otzenhausen, we spent the whole day looking at Brexit. So we started with a lecture from Nigel Foster, who is a professor from the Robert Kennedy College in Zurich, in Switzerland. And he's a British person who's a bit of an expert in Brexit, but being an expert in Brexit doesn't necessarily mean you understand it or know what's going to happen next, because it's kind of unprecedented in a way. So we went through Article 50, the trigger to leave the Union, why it was created, and it was sort of created as an emergency for countries to leave if their values changed dramatically or their economy can no longer sort of remain as part of the EU. It was never designed to be used like a country like Britain. It requires a ratification by the Council and the Parliament, and I don't think it's a particularly good way of exiting the Union. It's almost designed to prevent countries from exiting the Union, because the EU has a veto over you in a lot of ways. And if they don't get an extension on that 2-year date, which they seek, basically Britain and the EU's connection will cease entirely. Planes won't be able to fly. You won't be able to travel between the two. Trade rules will revert to WTO standards, which are they're very, very different. All the people living in Britain on EU passports won't really know what their status is, so it's important they get it done within the 2-year period or get an extension. And considering how much has to be done to get that to leave the Union, there's no way it can be done in 2 years, essentially. More or less, my understanding of it now is that I'm not actually convinced Brexit's ever really going to happen now. You can seek extension after extension, and if the EU don't really want them to leave, then maybe, hopefully, Britain's policies will change as public perception changes, maybe back to staying in the EU. Because at the end of the day, if they want to remain in the free market, they're probably going to have to accept free movement of people, which was one of the big reasons for Brexit. So and they're going to have to renegotiate trade deals. They haven't had a trade department for a long time, because trade is handled entirely by the EU Commission for the whole region. So they've actually flown in trade negotiating experts from Australia to help them build new trade agreements with the rest of the world, but that's a long period, and they're at the mercy of every other nation, because every other nation knows they need new trade deals if they're going to survive. So it'll be interesting to see if they ever actually manage to leave. After that, we had a workshop on how to leave the Union with Sebastian Zaisman, who held our previous workshop on passing a law in the EU. Very charismatic, funny guy who is really good at running these simulations. So we broke into 6 groups, 3 for the UK and 3 for the EU. I was given another interesting character. I was Theresa May this time, so I've been Nigel Farage, the President of the Court of Justice, and Theresa May all in a week, which was quite entertaining. So our group had to decide on the actual divorce proceedings. So actually, what the date will be, how much will be paid, when, and what we're going to accept, essentially, as part of the agreement. It was difficult to negotiate that. It's a tricky thing to simulate as well, but I think we negotiated a fairly okay deal. We essentially said that current residents from the EU would have a 4-year residency card that will be automatically issued to them, and then after that they'd have to apply for British residency or move back. The problem with that is there are people there who've lived in England their whole lives, have their children there, have no connection back to their homeland, and the proposal at the moment they're looking at is a life right to remain. So if somebody goes there now and has a child on a French citizenship, they'll be entitled to remain there for their entire life, even if the child was born today. So again, it's not really going to help part of the reason Britain did this, and apparently our deal wasn't really lifelike. But we came to an amicable agreement with the EU group, which was good. We presented it. It passed the Parliament and the Council, which is how we had to vote, and it passed the House of Commons in the UK. But we fell down on trade deals. Couldn't agree to one, obviously, because Britain has to take a lot of stuff it doesn't want to if it wants to remain in the common market. So we sort of had a deal and sort of not, which I think is very similar to how the actual Brexit negotiations are going to go. Like I said, there are no experts on this. It's just too new, too complicated, too unexpected. It does show a bit of a failing in academia and a lot of politicians that they didn't expect this to happen. They thought people would stay just because they wanted to stay. There wasn't really a Remain campaign like there was a Leave campaign. Definitely shows a bit of the disconnect between the politicians and the people in Europe and the whole world to a degree. But I see sort of why people combine it with the rise of Trump and this populist wave that's sweeping the world at the moment. People are unhappy, people are disconnected, people don't like the status quo, and they'll try anything at this point to change things. Unfortunately, they might not be trying the best things. And then, just quickly, on Thursday we looked at the EU and its neighbours. So, how to create prosperity, stability and security in a crisis-ridden neighbourhood, because the EU, there's sort of different levels of relations with the EU. You've got the EU, prospective member states, and then partner states. So the partner states cover a bigger part of Eastern Europe and North Africa and part of the Middle East. And we looked at how the negotiations are worked out with them, how they trade, and how they view their sort of cultural and societal norms. So they struggle in Georgia. They struggle with Georgia with the war crimes that may have been committed in 2008 and their treatment of LGBTIQ people. So they sort of don't want to condone that behaviour, but they want to keep them on side because it's easier to influence a friend, I suppose, than it is an enemy. But it's a very complex field. New member states joining and what they have to do to get there. I think the closest at the moment is Macedonia to becoming a latest member. Turkey has been in negotiations since 2005, but Turkey's being opposed quite considerably. And one interesting thing is that if Scotland manages to leave the UK, their accession to the EU might actually be quite difficult because Spain doesn't want their own independent... Well, there's a region in Spain, Catalonia, and the Basque Country, who want to be independent. So if Scotland successfully leaves the UK and can join the EU, it might inspire the Catalonia movement to do the same, and Spain doesn't want to lose Catalonia, so they'd veto Scotland joining to prevent their own country sort of breaking apart a little bit, which is interesting, not particularly democratic, and sort of a colonial attitude, I think, to not want part of your country to leave despite the popular opinion that it does, just because Barcelona is in Catalonia, which is where a lot of Spain's tourism revenue comes from. But to block another country from doing it who express a will to, I think, is a bit far, and I find it a bit concerning that they have that ability. But that's EU democracy. That's how it works. Yesterday we went to Saarbrücken, which is the capital of this region, which is a beautiful town that looks a lot like Adelaide in a weird way, has its own Rundle Mall and a river running through it. So I'll fill you in about that and what we did today after today. So thanks a lot. Only 2 more of these videos to go. I'll speak to you all soon.